We hear a lot about Sea Org members in Scientology, people who have signed a 1 billion year contract and dedicate their entire lives to forwarding the goals of Scientology. But it's very rare that two people who work in the city level class 5 orgs, such as London or Birmingham or New York, Berlin, etc., who have very public facing roles in Scientology, it's very rare these people sit down and talk about their experiences. So today I'm excited to talk with Mark Turi, a former staff member at San Francisco and also Berlin orgs, about our experiences, how we got lured in and recruited onto staff, and our recovery process and how we left. So stay tuned. It's a really interesting conversation. Hi Mark, welcome to my channel and the first interview I'm doing through this new StreamYard thing. So hopefully it all works out and we're not going to get cut off at any point. But how are you doing? Welcome to the channel.
Good. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Yeah, it's good to be here on a brand new channel with the next member and the next staff member, which is really cool. I don't know if I told you before, but I have been to England just once, London, and I did go to St. Hill. I got to tell you, London is not my favorite city. I had a really bad time in London. But I saw a fight on the tube, and some guy
No.
got his butt whooped, and then it was at the station called Earl's Court, and the police came in and they dragged him off the tube. So that was interesting. And then he scrinsted. So I went to St. Hill,
Oh
and
no.
that place was insane. So, yep.
Not a good
I'll come back though.
introduction
I'm sure
to...
it's a great country, but
Yeah, that's not really the painting London in the best light, is it? How long ago was that? Were
first
you
impression.
here? How long ago were you
It's
here?
Christmas of 2005. So yeah, a while ago.
Okay.
I still got to go back. I really want to head to Scotland, and I actually really want to see North England, and Ireland, Northern Ireland, and Ireland. So Wales, Cornwall, all the whole thing I want to see. But yeah, London didn't tickle my fancy, so to speak. It sort of went the other way. But what can you
Yeah,
do?
the UK, even though the UK is such a small country, there are so many different types of people and cultures. And like, if you go
Mhm.
200 miles north of London, it's almost like you're in a different country. You know, there's so many different like subcultures here. It's, you know, even I grew up in the UK and there are still many places I've never visited. So yeah, definitely come along and have a look. So where are you based now? For those of you who maybe aren't aware of your story and who you are, do you want to give a bit of a brief rundown in terms of very briefly your Scientology journey and where you are now and all that sort of stuff?
Yeah, basically, I joined Scientology in May of 2005 when I was in Los Angeles on vacation. And on one day in May of 2005, Saturday, I was body routed into the L. Ron Hubbard Life exhibition on Hollywood Boulevard. I saw the exhibit and then was introduced to some of Scientology basics, bought a couple books. And the same day, just 10 minutes after, I was body routed into the former Hollywood Test Center, which was at Hollywood Boulevard and Wilcox, which was an extension at the time of the the Los Angeles org, which was on Sunset in Vermont, where L. Ron Hubbard Way is. So I bought books. I was still on vacation, mind you. I did go to the Celebrity Center about a week after. And then when I returned home from my vacation, which was, I guess, a week or two after I discovered Scientology, I joined courses in my hometown, which is in Toronto, Canada. And I then, moved to Europe, and I started studying at the Berlin org. I did a work contract, came back to Toronto, and then the second time I went to Europe, I was staff member in Berlin, which was in May of 2007. So roughly 2 years after I joined. I stayed there until February of 2008, and there was a lot of just nonsense and horrible nightmarish scenarios that happened in Berlin with the new ideal org. Um, and then I was transferred to the San Francisco Day org, where I worked just for about 2.5 weeks, about 10 weeks in total, from March to May 2008. And then I ended up leaving Scientology in May of 2008. roughly 3 years, roughly to the day, that I actually discovered Scientology. And that was because I basically felt that after leaving staff, there was a situation which was very bizarre for me, and I just decided to leave. So then I actually moved to Los Angeles. I stayed in Los Angeles for a few years, but most of the time from 2011 for the next 10 years, I guess you could say, from 2011 till 2021, I mostly lived in Toronto or Ontario. I did my undergrad not too far from Toronto, and then now I'm, since September of 2021, I've been living in Hungary, in Budapest, which is where my father was born, and I have roots here and family here. So, and I've been here ever since. And I am studying, doing my master's degree, and so far I've had actually a really, really great time. And the weather's been fantastic. I know it's been pretty tough for people in the United States and Canada, but here it's been nice. So yeah, and I've been learning the language, which is very hard, but very much, away from Scientology. I didn't go back. I didn't decide. I, didn't give in. It was obviously not an easy decision to leave, but had a lot of guilt and so on in that decision after I left. But so far, I've just sort of dedicated my time to studying, learning more stuff, and educating myself on things like coercive control and what it means to be in a cult, how to recover from one or a destructive group, I guess, and sort of learning those different patterns on how to discover, I guess, or how to know when you're in a group, how to speak to people when they're in a group, that kind of thing. And really, since the past, I'd say 5 years have probably been much better than the previous. And as each year goes by, I feel sort of less and less fearful and less and less down and depressed, because it's been quite a long time since I've done any Scientology, and that decompression is a very positive thing, I think. So yeah, that's pretty much the long and short of it, I guess. The very brief part of it, and we'll obviously go into more details. But yeah, um, yeah. So far, nothing terrible as far as Scientology. Just when I left, I got harassed a little bit, but that ended briefly, and since then, it's been interesting, especially meeting ex-members, which is actually probably
Absolutely.
one of the best thing. Definitely the best thing was to meet people in Los Angeles who were ex-members and critics. And then there have been a number of people from the Berlin Org who I worked with. One person who is out, and actually about two or three people who aren't fully out yet, in the sense that they haven't publicly come out as ex-Scientologists. But it's just been interesting connecting and reconnecting with those individuals to talk about our stories. So yeah,
Absolutely. I think
all is well.
yeah, I'm really looking forward to, in our chat, covering a couple of things, because
Sure.
for those of you watching who don't know, there is a difference between a Scientology staff member and a Scientology Sea Org
Mhm.
member, right? So a lot
Yeah.
of the people who have spoken out already publicly about Scientology were Sea Org members, so they have
Mhm.
dedicated their lives and all future lives to the cause of Scientology. They signed a 1 billion-year contract and hold sort of
Mhm.
like international management type roles. And there have been a few staff members and public Scientologists who didn't join staff that have spoken out, but this is actually, as far as I can tell, um, also just to cover a bit more on that, staff members signed a 2.5 or a 5 year contract and
Yeah.
work in what's called Class 5 orgs. So those are your city level churches, London, Berlin, New York, any city you can think of with the Church of Scientology is generally
Mhm.
staffed by staff members who have volunteered their time and work like a normal job, Monday to Friday, 9 to 5 or 6. And then there's a foundation org, which is the evenings and weekends. And then in some orgs, they kind of combine the two, but we'll get into that later. But from
Mhm.
what I can tell, this conversation that we're having is actually the first time on YouTube that two Class 5 staff members have got together to talk about their experiences without a SEALG member being involved. So I think we're making a bit of history here on YouTube, which is interesting. But I think also it's interesting. I want to talk to you about the process of getting into Scientology, because you
Mhm.
and I both were completely raw in terms of not,
Mhm.
having Scientology family. We weren't raised in it. We came across it on our own accord and very quickly joined staff and then volunteered in
Mhm.
a city level organization. You have the benefit of having worked in a couple of different orgs in the world, so you might have a few different interesting experiences and perspectives on things. But why don't we start by kind of how you got in? I know you said that you went into the L. Ron Hubbard Life Exhibition Center in LA, and they got you from there. But did you
Mhm.
have any knowledge of Scientology before that? Like, had you read any bad, they call it black PR, right? Bad press about Scientology or stories, or what was your knowledge before joining Scientology?
Yeah. Well, there was a little bit. So growing up, my father, who grew up in Montreal, um, he had a friend growing up, his best friend growing up. Um, that friend's sister had actually joined Scientology, I guess sometime in either the 70s or the 80s, and she had married an American. They went to Los Angeles, and she was a Scientologist at least for a decade, and apparently was also a lawyer. So she did what she did. I don't really remember her name or anything. I haven't really seen any of her course completions. It was just always kind of like when my father would talk about growing up, sometimes at the dinner table or whatever, he would mention he had this friend and this friend had a sister and so forth. So there was always some degree of the word Scientology, just a couple times maybe growing up, and not too many times, but I probably heard it 3, 4 times, whatever, maybe less, maybe more. It's hard to say, but just sort of growing up. But really, the first time I ever sort of looked into Scientology was I was in high school. So this is going back to the late 90s. And there was I think a 3, 4, 5 part little piece that Entertainment Tonight did. And Entertainment Tonight is an entertainment weekly show, a daily show actually from Monday to Friday. I'm sure it's still on. I haven't watched it in years, but basically focusing on entertainment news, right? So what are celebrities doing and so forth, culture in LA and whatnot, movies, TV shows, whatever. And there was I guess a 3, 4, 5 part series on Celebrity Center. So they had a video crew go to Celebrity Center to one of the galas, and I remember Denny Masterson was interviewed about Scientology. So was Leah Remini, some of the Jenna Elfman, like some of the celebrities at the time that were on TV. I mean, Denny Masterson was on That 70s Show. Jenna Elfman was on Dharma Greg. Leah Remini was on The King of Queens. So, like, there were a lot of people who were on TV and doing movies who were involved, and they did like a whole thing about that. They did an introduction to Scientology. They talked about the basic concepts in some sense, more PR sense than the nitty gritty technical stuff. But they toured the Celebrity Center. There was the restaurant was that called the Renaissance. They looked at the garden. So it was a puff piece, of course, but it was a really interesting one. So I guess around that time, I sort of became interested. I can't remember again if I asked my mom or dad, but I guess I was sort of new the word Scientology and it was foreign to me. And so what I did was, like for most people would do now, is you go to Google, and Google was quite new in the late 90s. I guess this had to be somewhere between like 98 and 2000. So it was before Battlefield Earth, but it was just right around the time when Google was starting to get quite large. And I
You
typed
didn't go to
Scientology
Ask
into
Jeeves
Google.
then, you went to Google. I remember Ask
Yeah, that's
Jeeves
right.
around those times.
I
That was
remember
my
Alta
search engine
Vista.
of choice.
Yeah, do you remember Alta Vista? Because Alta Vista was
Yes.
the first one. Yeah,
Yes. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
that was like, and Alta Vista literally, and Ask Jeeves, yeah, and Yahoo, of course, search engines. Now there's Bing, but everyone uses Google,
Yeah.
pretty much. But yeah, those those ones, and Netscape had also Netscape Search. That was like the first one from like '96 or something. I had to use them in class when I was in, grade school. Um, but yeah, okay. So I type in Scientology, and of course, two big perspectives come out, which is Scientology had a website back then. It was not very big. But then they also had like Operation Clambake, and they had different groups like this. So there's basically either Operation Clambake or Scientology.org, I guess it is, or whatever.
And
And
Just
I
just
looked
for
through both
those
of those
who
sites.
just for those who are watching that maybe don't have
Sure.
such a great understanding of all these sort of terms we're talking about, Operation Clambake was
Yes.
like one of these websites that was up there that was kind of really one of the first like major anti-Scientology websites, right? Where lots of documents were uploaded from
Mhm.
lawsuits and things, and it was one of the major exposing websites against Scientology, right? And it's still up there today,
Absolutely.
I believe. I don't think it's updated
Mhm.
anymore, but it's a real wealth of information um, about Scientology and people uploading real factual evidence rather than just, stories and hearsay, right?
Exactly. So the gentleman who started that was a man named Andreas Helge Lund, who I met many years ago in Los Angeles, 2009-ish, from Norway. Whole background on that. But the website, the actual URL is xenu.net. Of course, I never knew what Xenu was or who Xenu was or anything like this. And his website basically breaks down the Xenu story. I mean, that's the whole thing. And in the mid 90s, so just a few years before I was, stumbled upon this website, they had actually posted the OT3 materials and stuff like this. There's a guy named Dennis Ehrlich who was involved in that, and so on. So there was also controversy because Scientology went after them for copyright and all these things. Of course, I didn't know that at the time. I was just a teenager. But I guess I don't really recall. Like, I don't really have a recollection of what I would have seen that day. I sort of just have a very, very vivid, excuse me, vague memory. I shouldn't say vivid, vague memory of finding those two different websites. But what I would have read or what I would have seen, I don't recall.
Yeah,
Um,
just like
but
anyone, if you were
obviously,
to Google
yeah,
Scientology today, you're gonna have, your interest is to know more. You're gonna Google it. You're gonna look at a couple of different websites, and they maybe will or won't make an impact on you. But it's not
yeah,
like you kind of looked at all of this stuff on Operation Clambake and learned all of these materials and,
no,
remembered them all. And when you went into the Scientology org, you were kind of like, oh, I've heard about Xenu and all of this. And,
no,
you had like an awareness of it, but, you weren't spending hours and hours a day looking at
no.
Scientology stuff, right? You were just kind of researching it and came across some pro Scientology stuff and some
Yeah.
anti Scientology stuff, like anyone would in their research, right?
Yeah, and at that time there was just basically those two things. I mean, even back in the 90s, the internet it had a lot of websites, but it as far as Scientology was concerned, it seemed to be like this is the greatest thing ever, this is the worst thing ever, and that's it. There was no middle, no nuance, no nothing.
Sure.
So yeah, so I would have looked around and probably read some stuff on both sides. And then because I was a teenager, because I didn't have a car, because I didn't, have access to go to downtown Toronto. I grew up in a suburb, roughly 35 kilometers. I don't know how many miles that is, but yeah, 20, 25 miles or something away, which is like 35 clicks. So I think maybe I'm wrong on that. But it takes around 45 minutes to go from my house on a good day to the city. And I knew that the org was there and whatnot. So I sort of put it out of my head. And then I guess a year or two later would have been when Battlefield Earth came out. I read the book, got it from the library, read the book. I saw the movie. Um, John Travolta, also, I do remember him on Oprah, either the late 90s or early 2000s, probably around the time that Battlefield Earth was doing its promotion. So maybe 2000. He was on Oprah. He did an interview with Oprah about Scientology and L. Ron Hubbard. And at the end of that show, they actually put up like what do you call it? Like a graphic on where you could call and buy the book, What is Scientology? Of course, you probably know there were two versions, the old version from the 70s, but this was the new version from the late 90s. So they put up a number if you want to order it, whatever. So I was more aware of the promotional stuff like that in pop culture.
And this was John Travolta and not the Tom Cruise Oprah interview where he jumped on the
That was
couch and all
later.
of that. This was a different
Yeah,
John Travolta interview, right? Okay.
that's
And what
correct.
did you
That's correct.
so what did you think when you read these things online that were either saying Scientology is the greatest thing on earth or Scientology is the worst thing on earth? What did you think at the time? And then subsequent to that, when you were first getting into Scientology, um,
Mhm.
had your opinion changed, or how did that maybe influence the way you approach Scientology when you first started, going in and doing courses and things like that?
Well, I was very curious. I mean, if you have something that's just so black and white, I just started to get really interested in it. So by 2005, by the time I was discovering it, and that summer, that's when Tom Cruise did his whole thing with War of the Worlds. But I had just joined or was interested in it just a little bit before that whole incident. So I was just very interested. So I go through the L. Ron Hubbard Life exhibition, and again, I'm hearing, I'm remembering my father saying, yeah, his friend's sister was in a cult for 10 years. A cult, this cultists are scary, and then the select like things kind of came back. I was apprehensive at first going in because L. Ron Hubbard Scientology, but then the people there were able to essentially just disarm me and make it seem like this is the thing that's going to help me. And of course, um, people that were there were very, they looked very, as we would call it, upstat, happy, bright, whatever. And it just became more and more curiosity. And I think for me, when I was younger, for sure, there was a way to sort of, push my buttons in a curious way where I would just go all in on something. Now I'm a little bit more seasoned, a little bit more jaded in some cases, cynical in other cases. But I still have that curiosity where if somebody just sort of tickles my fancy a little bit, I can go out and read dozens of books on a particular issue. It's not as much anymore because it's a lot of energy, but that was kind of it. Like it was almost like, okay, now I found what I'm looking for, and they've put it together in this sort of a presentation. And I was in Los Angeles. I wanted to move to Los Angeles. I wanted to live in the United States. They made some promises about that. And so it seemed like it was just going to unfold. Like, to be completely honest, if anyone was me in that situation, and I also had, things going on that in my personal life that also weren't great at the same time, but I think most people would have been sold on that pitch. I mean, it was a really, really great pitch, and I didn't have the hindsight to know where the road would lead. So, at least for me, they pressed the buttons of curiosity, and I just literally just went with it headfirst, dived into
One
it.
thing that they are really good at doing, I did a video on this recently on my channel about the tactics that they use to answer your questions.
Mhm.
So even, one question I get asked a lot is, how could anyone possibly join
Yeah.
Scientology nowadays with all this bad PR
Mhm.
and, stuff out there? I mean, this stuff has been out there for years. It's not new news. There is more stuff coming out there, but in terms of um, there being two opposite opinions about Scientology being either really good or really bad, since the early days of the internet, like you say, in the early 90s, there was still content
Mhm.
out there saying Scientology is not good. So, there's always, been various opinions on whether it's good or bad that could
Yeah.
influence people before you go in. It's not so much of a barrier once someone decides to go into an org,
Mhm.
because they have such a good way of answering your questions to make you feel like you're satisfied and would like to know more. With things
Yeah.
like the Xenu story, they'll either outright lie and say no, we don't believe in that, or they'll come up with some excuse or disconnection. They might say, well, it's kind of, that is a thing, but you kind of don't understand it, it's not quite
Mhm.
like that. And they get you into a place of going, well, look, Scientology is not about, sign a billion-year contract, give us $500,000 and we'll give you spiritual enlightenment. It's not as
Mhm.
clear a hard sell as that. It's very much step by step. Well, look, we understand you have questions and you
Mhm.
have suspicions, and we understand you have read this stuff and you're a bit concerned. Well, why don't you just buy a book and read it yourself in your own time and see what you think? Or
Mhm.
why don't you do this one course? This course is, $50. It's, if you do
Mhm.
it 2 hours a day for 3 weeks, you'll be done. You get a certificate at the end, and it will help you communicate better, or it will help you understand how to manage your finances better, or whatever the course is you're sold. Um, no harm done, because all you're doing is
Yeah.
reading this material, learning something, applying it. And if you don't agree with it, if it doesn't work for you, that's absolutely fine. You can walk on and never come back in, no pressure. And I think that's
Right.
something that people don't understand, is the way they get you with, even if you walk in and say, I'm really skeptical and I think
Mhm.
that you guys are a cult and I don't want to be abused or coercively controlled, they will handle you in any way possible on all of your objections. But the
Mhm.
fallback is, well, what's the harm done? You came in here because you're interested to find out a little bit more. We're not, how can that it be a bad thing if you were just to buy a book and read it or just do one course? Because there's no obligation to continue. And
That's
once
correct.
they
Yeah.
plant that seed in your head, you kind of think, "Oh, yeah, fair enough. That kind of makes sense. Why, what, there is no harm done in just doing one course or just reading a book, or, because you're very much in control and you can walk away at any point." But that's how they get you, right? Did they have any objections to you at that point in time, in terms of you having read anti-Scientology stuff? Did you bring it to them up front and say, I've read this or heard this? Or did you just have it in the back of your mind and, thinking about it while you were proceeding with your journey?
Well, what happens, at least from what I can remember, before I took my first course, which was the Hubbard Dianetics seminar, was my very first course, $52 at the time. You go in for like an interview that people do. I guess it's like an ethics interview, I guess, and they ask you questions like, if you have surveillance from the government, are you a journalist on a story? And they said, like, what have you heard about Scientology? This is one of the questions. And I said, yeah, familiar. There's this website called Xenu.net. I had very briefly subscribed to a news group called alt.religion.scientology. Very briefly, I don't again even recall what I read or saw on that because it was such a brief little, like, I joined and then I unjoined very quickly after. But I gave them all that information. I just said, like, hey, I'm open to this. None of it's true, fine. They disarm you with that. Again, they say, well, one of the first things you learn is in Scientology, if it isn't true, if it isn't true for you, and what's true is only true because you've observed it. And so stuff about aliens and Xenu and all this kind of stuff, like, they don't even, it goes over most people's head because most people have not even got the OT3. So, and I was more interested in doing Dianetics, and doing Dianetics auditing had nothing really to do with anything that had to do with space operas. So they again, they just sort of disarmed it. And but I literally told them the first day, and you get more than one interview as well sometimes, because when I was on my seminar, and then I did the Hubbard Dynamics Auditors course, I did Success Through Communications, I did a whole couple, the intro courses. Um, when I was trying to attest to those courses, I was not getting floating needles, and there was this whole thing. For whatever reason, I couldn't get a floating needle, and then they were, going through these different qualifications, of course, um,
I think, just to
and
pause there a second, just to give a bit of
yeah,
context to people who maybe aren't followers of
of
Scientology,
course.
floating needle, this whole, what we're talking about here is when you finish a course in Scientology, there's someone called an examiner who, once you finish the course and you say, I'm done and I finished, and you've learned what you've needed to learn, you can apply whatever, you go into a room and they use the e-meter to basically verify that you have understood everything and you can apply it. And you want the goal, this is very, very briefly explained, but the goal is to get what's called a floating needle, which means the needle on the e-meter is kind of going back and forth like this, which
Hmm.
means you're happy, you've understood everything, and you're not holding anything back. And it's just a very brief check at the end of a course, to make sure that you've understood it and you're good, you're feeling happy. And if you don't have that floating needle, they tell you to go back and
Yeah.
reread something, or try and find a word you haven't understood, or there's something you haven't quite got in your mind, and you have to go back and do it again until you can give them this, what's called a floating needle. And that's done by the qual division qualifications, so that you
Mhm.
have to pass that test at the end of each course you do, before they'll give you the certificate and say you're done with the course.
That's right. Yeah, and basically what happened was that is I had to get ethics conditions, lower conditions. I can't remember which one it was, but it's probably danger, non-existent, some low condition. And part of that is that you have to sort of confront certain things, like you have to testify, I guess, or you have to explain who your friends are, who your friends aren't. And so I remember doing these ethics write-ups and being like, I saw this information when I was younger. I don't really remember, but these people are not my friends. These people are, people who want to improve their life are my friends. It's basically just control nonsense. But at the time, of course, I didn't know. Um, and that was it. Like, I did my ethics handling, and then I just went on to my next course, and then I still had some problems with getting floating needles. But also, in the end, like most people are in Scientology, especially at certain levels, are really incompetent. And so, like, the qualsec in Toronto was just utterly incompetent, and was not a good qualsec. And so then you get these different opinions on, like, yeah, you had a floating needle, but it wasn't right, the floating needle. But then this person didn't know what a floating needle. It's like, it was such a rigmarole. I just hated it, the incompetence and the ineptness of the staff. However, eventually, I rolled on into my different courses and completed extension courses and did a whole bunch of other stuff before I got to staff, but all intro services. I have never had done anything on the bridge, just because Purif really wouldn't have been for me medically, and then training and stuff, which I would have liked to have done. My purpose was to be an auditor, but I didn't even get to method one. That would have been, had I stayed in, that would have been the next step, would have been getting onto M1 word clearing. But then I wouldn't be able to do the Purif, so who knows how long I would have lasted after that. Um, and actually, I shouldn't say that. I did do method one word clearing maybe once or twice, but it was like close to the end of my, my affiliation. So basically, that was it. So that was sort of my first difficulties in Scientology, and stuff that I just didn't like, that didn't make sense. And I really wasn't working towards a goal of getting to California and being on staff there. They undermined my goals. They tried to, they change your goals. You're not supposed to, what's the word that we used to use, like undermining your case or something. You're not really supposed to do that, but people do that all the time. And it's
Invalidate.
just it's yeah, exactly, invalidate. Yes, they're not supposed to invalidate your whatever. But then I wanted to be an auditor, and then someone would say, okay, do this, and then, like, it was so much nattering, and it's so much like chatter, and so many different opinions that just don't coalesce, that it was very bizarre. But um yeah, but eventually I did write everything down. I did have my ethics conditions. I was clear, in the sense of, I thought I was clear from that past responsibility, not clear the state of clear. I mean, like, I thought we were past it, because I had done everything. I had gone through the ethics conditions. I had gone to these upper conditions. And then by the time, you know, 3 years after, when I was leaving Scientology, that stuff would come back to me. And that was a huge surprise. So again, being honest is as worse in Scientology than hiding stuff. I mean, you might feel guilty hiding stuff, but if you hide things, they can't use it to the things that you're not saying against you in the future. And so it was just really like a big pain in the butt. And so, um, I although I was honest, and the honesty was the thing that got me out, I'm happy. But had I really wanted to stay in Scientology, you really shouldn't be terribly honest.
Yeah.
People cheat all the time, I'm sure, doing their stuff. But yeah, that was just my perspective on that.
And on that point of honesty and integrity, one question I've been noticing quite a lot
Yeah.
on different live streams and things that are happening with other sort of former Scientologist YouTubers is the question
Yeah.
of how they get around the whole concept of not paying staff, right? So you were on
Mm.
staff in San Francisco and in Berlin. Were you in staff in Toronto as well, or were you just a public when you were in
No,
Toronto? Just a
just
public.
public.
But in Germany, particularly, Scientology is not considered a religion. It is not a
Mhm.
charity. And in fact, to this day, if you want to work for the German government, you have to sign a declaration that says you are not a
Mhm.
Scientologist. There's a whole legal case and story there that we can get into another time. But um,
Sure.
effectively, in any Scientology church in the world that you ever go to, you're not being paid, right? It's a
Yeah.
religious volunteer job, right? When I signed my staff contract in London, again, Scientology is not a charity here in the UK. It is
Hmm.
recognized as a religion in some way. It wasn't when I was in Scientology, but it's not a charity. So it's not tax exempt. It's not, seen as existing for the public benefit. However, when you sign your employment contract with the church, it's still saying you are a religious volunteer. And in most jurisdictions, there is a subclause of the employment rights part of law that says if you are a religious volunteer, you can get around the minimum wage and that sort of thing,
Hmm.
regardless of whether you're registered as a charity or not. You can still
Right.
volunteer in a religious way. What was the setup like when you were particularly in Germany? Because in Berlin, you were on staff there. What was it, a similar thing with a religious volunteer contract, or did they have to be a bit more sneaky about how to get away without paying you?
Well, from what I recall, I think so. They are registered as an incorporated, like an Inc., right? Like in America, you have whatever Inc. So an incorporated something or other, and I think it's called a GmbH. Like they're the Scientology Kirche GmbH, and GmbH is like that thing. It's like Inc. or incorporated. So they are considered, I guess, private in some way. I don't know if they're considered profit or nonprofit or whatever. I think from what I remember, um, because you're a volunteer, you have to get something, but but there was really no watchdog group. I mean, and there might be, but as far as I knew, there wasn't keeping track on the hours that people were working because nobody was really going to the government and saying, I'm working, as I was working 90 plus hours a week. I think the whole idea is in Germany, if you volunteer for something, you have to earn some cash, like something. And so they kind of around that. I know when you do volunteer work in Canada, when I was doing internships with TV companies when I was in college, they had to provide something. So they normally just paid for my parking, which ended up being, expensive because there's, a lot in downtown Toronto that was literally right across from the office. But that was something. I mean, I used to park down there. What used to be expensive was $18 a day. Now it's, $40, $50. But they would give me that. They would validate my parking. They would pay for it. So that was something. Or in other cases, maybe lunch or whatever would be provided. But that's how they kind of do it. They sort of skirt the law. And then minimum wage is weekly in places in Europe, some places in Europe. So, for example, when I was there in Berlin, minimum wage was 100 euros a week, but I got paid maybe 88 euros 2 weeks, and that was like the highest. So somehow they
Wait,
skirt
you
the
got paid
laws.
88 euros
Yeah.
every 2 weeks when you were on
I'm sorry.
staff.
I apologize. For 2 weeks, 2 weeks in total, meaning it was during Christmas, like during December. I got paid 88 euros twice, and that was the highest staff pay that I had ever gotten. But it wasn't every 2 weeks. That was like
So
the anomaly of
so
getting
like
paid that
equivalent of
much.
40 euros a week. So 40 euros a week, you're
No,
basically getting average.
the normal pay, the average was 25, but of course week to week it depends on how much you make. So when I was first getting there, we were getting paid and I was an expediter. We were getting 40 to 50 a week, 60 a week, and then it dropped down to around 20ish. And then in December, for whatever reason, we had one week that was really good, and then subsequently another week that was really good, and we got paid over 80. But most weeks was anything from 10 to 20 euros on average per week, and then every once in a while we might get a 60 or a 50 or a 40. It
And
always
I think
depends.
one thing
Staff
to
there,
bear in
yeah.
mind as well with people who volunteer to work as staff members or Sea Org in Scientology and so on is no one is complaining about not being paid, right?
Yep.
When you join staff, you're already indoctrinated enough to believe that Scientology is the way forward and you can help people through Scientology. And that's why you're committing either 2.5 or 5 years of your life to
Mm-hmm.
working for the church. And you do it in the the exchange that is offered is you're not doing it for the money, you're doing it because you want to help people. And in return, you can get free services, free processing, and so on. In
Yeah.
reality, you don't generally get those free services because you're too busy doing jobs on your post that there's just no time for it. But theoretically, there is an exchange there. But when at the point of signing your self contract, you are doing it because you want to help people, and that's the best way of helping people. It doesn't matter if you get paid or not. If you get a bit of
Mhm.
money, great, that's like a bonus, right? As a staff member, you see it as an extra, oh amazing, we can, we got some extra money this week, this is great. You expect to get nothing, so when you do get 20 bucks,
Right.
it's great. You have to make arrangements outside of Scientology to pay your rent and this sort of thing.
Mhm.
If you're in the SEAL, it's a slightly different kettle of fish because you are committing your entire life and they provide accommodation and food and that sort of thing. But as a staff member, it's just like a normal day job that you're doing, and you're just volunteering that time, and you have to provide your own accommodation, food, and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But this is what's interesting when it comes to staff pay: is no one working for a church is going to be sat there thinking, God, we need to get paid at least minimum wage for this job, because they're doing it because they want to help, not because they want to become millionaires from Scientology, right?
Mhm. And that's in the contract. It says basically you're not here to make money. If you're here to make money, whatever, get off staff, or if you moonlight, your job that you moonlight can't take you away from your staff. Like it's absurd. Like you're working at minimum 40 hours, maybe 20 hours depending on the schedule, but usually about 40 plus hours a week plus your study supposedly. And then it's like, but they don't pay you anything. So then if you get a second job and the second job is giving you more money and you want to leave staff, you technically have to leave that job to go back on staff. It's like absolutely, a trap of you can't do anything. So most people leave. Most people have no affinity to being on staff, and so they get most people get like staff pay. They get their pay once and then they're gone. You really have to be strongly involved in Scientology, born and raised in it, or have done it for a while to be able to keep up that facade. But if we had people who would come off the street in a sense, or they would quit a job and they would join staff, and then yeah, you get paid €5 or €6 or whatever it was, and then we never see the people again. So it doesn't work for the average person. You basically have to be indoctrinated to a certain degree, usually at least 1 or 2 years involved, if not more, and have done some Scientology auditing, and then try to make a schedule where you're either working day or foundation, and then the other hours you're working somewhere part time. But even now, I mean, with inflation and with things getting as expensive, it's becoming less and less realistic to be a staff member on at a class 5 org in general,
Mm.
because even working a minimum wage job, plus if you have to do 40 plus hours in Scientology, you're going to be working 80 plus hours or more. And then in some places like in the US where there's no health insurance, it's absurd.
Especially
So
in
I
places like London, where if you
yeah.
have a job where you're working full time, 5 days a week, nine to
Mhm.
five, kind of standard office hours at minimum wage, you would still
Yeah.
struggle to live in London,
Yep.
right? Because just
Absolutely.
that's the way cities are. And I'm just interested to explore a little bit more about your journey onto staff, because obviously
Mhm.
you are at this point studying and you're interested and you're learning a lot. And how did that conversation go from did someone just come up to you and say, hey, do you want to join staff? How did they have to have a did they have to convince you? Was it a hard job to get you onto staff, or were you happy to just do it and dropped everything? What was that recruitment process like for you?
Well, when I moved to Europe in 2005 in September, I was doing courses in the old Berlin org before the ideal org, and I made friends with people. So fast forward to Christmas in 2006, I went on vacation again to Los Angeles, and I went to the New Year's Eve event at the Shrine Auditorium in 2006, which is, I guess, is December, whatever it is. and 29th or 28th they put it on. And there was a video where they opened the Berlin org, and I had no idea that Berlin was going to have an ideal org. It was actually something that was um, an order that was basically very like hastily kind of made for other reasons. They were going to put one in Stuttgart. They said no, and they put it in Berlin. And so it was very quickly put together, with sticks and glue. And here was the new Berlin org. So when I saw the video, I saw people who I knew, and I was also working that time. I had a job working at a retail store, and I had got laid off on that one, unfortunately, which was a really great job that I loved. But after about 4 months, I got laid off, and I through some communication, I don't remember exactly how. I know that I would have emailed, or they, like the people in Berlin, either would have emailed me or I would have emailed them something about Berlin, like something about how I just had seen the video. There was some conversation because I still had contact specifically with someone who I knew. Her name was Helena, and we had email contact throughout 2006 and into early 2007. And I guess during that time, that's when the recruitment cycle began. I'm not sure if I'm the one who said I want to join staff, or if they said you should come join staff, or whatever. But I had wanted to join staff. I was actually looking to join staff in the US, but for whatever reason, and impulsively, I guess, and I can't really recall, but we made that contact, and then the cycle was open, so to speak, and I was going to Berlin. And so the only thing was, my sister was getting married, so we waited until about a week after she had gotten married in 2007, and I went. But that was the condition that I would go. I would go. It was like the second week of May. So again, it's hard to remember. Like staff was always on my mind. I always wanted to join staff because I couldn't afford Scientology, and like you mentioned, they give you that little carrot of you can get free services. Um, and I just wanted to be more involved. I was actually kind of doing extension courses at that time, not really active in the org. I had done successful communications, which I hated. And so I was kind of on the outer banks, so to speak, of being a Scientologist. And Scientology is it's so counterproductive, because when I think back now, I'm thinking to myself, or what I was thinking of was, well, I'm on this outer region of Scientology. Why don't I just jump headfirst into Scientology? That'll be what will want me to bring back if I'm doing Scientology every day. And of course, by the first week I was even in Berlin, I had the thought in the back of my head, like, what the hell's going on? I don't know if this is going to work. I had issues with visas. I was working extremely long hours. I didn't like anybody. I didn't speak German. And so really it was like, had to put on the face of being a good staff member. I did the best that I could. I got settled, and then eventually, thankfully, I had to leave, which was a blessing in disguise. But that process was just basically like, they were recruiting in Berlin. They were recruiting people from all over Europe, as well as different parts of the world. They recruited someone from Kenya, although they had been living in Germany at the time. They recruited someone from Bulgaria, from Croatia, again, living in Germany at the time. They recruited a lot of people from Switzerland, from other cities in Germany, from the Czech Republic, from Hungary. And I just happened to be, the one guy that somehow was able to come back to Berlin from Canada, which was also an anomaly. I mean, they stuffed me in treasury because I didn't speak German. And again, it was difficult. It was very, very difficult. But that really was the process. I mean, again, I just cannot recall if I sent this person, Helena, an email, or she sent me an email. But regardless, I was in that cycle, and most of my early 2007 was, I had spent 2 months unemployed, and I just saved money because I was living with my mom. Sister got married, and the next week I left for Berlin, and it was sort of something that happened. And I don't even, it's very bizarre. I can't even put it into too many words now, because it's looking back, it was such a bad choice. But
Hmm.
And if you
They
want to join staff, they make it happen. Basically, if you want to
yeah.
do it, you will
They
do it.
use
Yeah,
the same
yeah,
tactic when they
yeah,
try and recruit you in to do courses and getting you in as
yeah.
a public Scientologist. They use the same tactic once you're already in and studying to get you on staff. They
Hmm.
tell you, well, what have you got to lose, right? You're not
Yeah,
signing your billion-year contract life away seal. This is
yeah.
just a 2.5-year contract, and it's Monday to Friday or whatever the contract is that you make with them. What have you got to lose? Because you can
Hmm.
try it and you can work hard at it and you'll help people. And if it doesn't work out, so what? You can go about your business and do what you want to do after your contract is over. But
Hmm.
even if you don't like it very much, it's 2.5 years, which isn't a great deal of time. And in that time, even if you've not had a great time, you've helped people because people in the
Yeah.
Scientology staff members believe that Scientology is the best way to help humanity. So they use
Hmm.
that same tactic that they used when they tried to get you in by saying, well, what have you got to lose? Just read the book, try the course, see how you feel. There's no contractual obligation. Why not? They do the same thing with staff. Why not try it? Just sign the 2.5-year contract, try it out. If you don't like it, then you don't have to do another 2.5-year contract. And it's just really interesting to me anyway to see how they use the same tactic to try and lure you in. They also like to guilt trip. I
Yeah.
don't know if they did that with you, but with me, they did.
Yeah.
When they were trying to get me on into the Sea Org, one of the big
Mm.
things they used to say was, "You believe Scientology is the best way of helping humanity, right?" And you're like, yeah,
Yeah.
okay. And you already realize that being on staff is help, right? Yeah. So therefore, why wouldn't you want to join the Sea Org? Because the Sea Org
Yeah.
is the ultimate commitment, and that's the best way of helping people because you're spending your life doing it. And that just makes
Hmm.
you feel like, well, now I feel bad for not signing my contract because yeah, I want to help people, and yeah, they like to use that guilt trip. Did they do any of that with you when they were trying to get you in?
Again, like I had sent an email to the recruiters in Berlin, and I'm pretty sure I would have said something like, "Yeah, I'm only doing extension courses. Like, I'm not really going up the bridge. I don't want to join staff in Toronto because it's expensive, whatever, right?" And yeah, they made it kind of like, well, just take the dive and jump in, and if you're doubting, just do Scientology full time and you'll be fine. You'll know that it's for you, and this and that. And whenever I tried to leave, because I didn't really have a proper visa, I had a residence permit, which wasn't for 2.5 years. But even just trying to leave, like, you can't leave. And so here I was trying to be a good Scientologist. So if I leave and I blow, regardless of whether or not I'm actually committing a crime, an immigration crime in Germany, they don't care about that. If I was to blow, if I was to leave before my staff contract was up, then of course you get a freeloader bill, and you can never do Scientology until you pay back that freeloader bill. And of course, I was scared that it would be more money than I could afford, and so it's just a lot of scare tactics and fear, keeping people inside, and that
That's
their ethics, which are completely immoral and unethical, like violating immigration law, um, is just to keep people in, because you're in a prison, basically, in a mental prison, as Jason Bigay says, is prison of belief. The book is, you're in that prison, and so you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. So you might as well just, like I did, like try to make it work every day while you're there, while agreeing to everything and trying your hardest. And then
mm.
eventually, I left. So they
And
didn't even care, you know.
the freeloader bill is one of those scare tactics. So part of that
Yeah.
religious commitment staff contract that you sign, where you say you get free processing in return for your
Mhm.
time working for free instead of being paid, one of the uh, caveats is if you are to break your staff contract early, then you then have to pay for all of the servicing that you got for free. And that includes
That's
your
right.
staff training. So when you join staff,
Yeah.
you have to do what's called staff status 0, which is to getting
Yeah.
to know the building and where everything is very quick. You do it in a day. Staff
Hmm.
Status 1 and Staff Status 2, which are kind of the basic staff courses that teach you how a Scientology organization works and operates and runs, and what the posts are and who does what, and how ethics works. And then you go into your hatting, where you're training specifically for the actual role that you're posted in. Now, these are courses that are compulsory. You have to do your staff status 0, 1, and 2 in order to be qualified as a staff member, and you cannot hold a post until you've done those.
Yeah.
And obviously, you don't pay for them because you're a staff member. It's free, it's staff training. But if you were to leave your contract early, they give you a bill and they go, yeah, no problem. You can leave early. You go and do you, but you can't
Hmm.
get any further Scientology process. And you can't even do a course as a public member of Scientology like you were doing before you joined staff until
That's
you
right.
pay us back for all of that free training that we gave you. And quite often,
Hmm.
people are sat there thinking, well, if I wasn't on staff, I wouldn't have done the star status courses. So why do I need to pay for them? Well, because you broke your commitment. And it kind of makes sense. And you think it's kind of fair at the time. You go, well, yeah, fair
That's right.
enough. You gave me free servicing. I should, but then that completely invalidates all of the time you've given them that you've not been paid for. So it doesn't
Exactly.
really work. But did you, when it did come to time of like to the time of you leaving Scientology, um,
Hmm.
what did that look like? Because you got a freeloader bill in the end, right? They gave you
Yeah.
one of these bills, right?
Yeah. Basically, what happened was I was in San Francisco, and I was not happy in San Francisco. Again, it was just something where I had to get I actually ended up getting like a proper US, what's called an R1 religious workers visa. So, and then later I would get my student visa. So I was, completely legal in that sense. Um, but I was having issues. I was having problems. I was living in an apartment with two people that were second gens, and they were horrible. And I showed up late a couple times. I hated, I mean, here's the thing. When I was in Berlin, I really didn't study at all. I got through my staff status 1 and 0. And then there was a course supervisor who was absolutely just a ruthless, terrible person. And so I just threw my hands up. I was in the middle of staff status 2. I threw my hands up. I said, I can't do this. I'm not going into the course room. So I would go to the library to do my studying, and I ended up literally reading every course pack of every auditor course that there was. So I don't know the technical stuff, but the theory stuff I read literally from method 1 all the way to class 5 grad, because they're there. I listened to tons of lectures. I did all that kind of stuff for months. But when I got to San Francisco, because everything was in English, I just noticed like I hate studying. Like I hate it in Berlin, I hate it in Toronto. So why wouldn't I hate it in San Francisco? And for me, I'm the type of learner where I'm extremely visual, but I'm also very direct. And what I hated about Scientology was that everything was so nebulous. Like if I remember the first time that I was introduced to a clay demonstration, and I was like, just tell me what to do so I can move on, because you're trying to do this clay demo and they're giving you these little aloof nebulous instructions, and I
Just
was
before
like,
we go
just
down too much of a rabbit
tell
hole,
me.
for those who are
Yeah.
watching a clay, do you want to just explain a clay demo and what that is to those who maybe aren't
Yeah,
Scientology?
basically, sorry if I'm getting a little through the weeds here, but basically, when you learn study technology, you have to sort of mold clay into these different situations and label them, and the course supervisor will come around, and so I'm learning how to do this clay demonstration. So, and it just didn't. Point is, it didn't make sense. It wasn't part of the way that I learned. I wasn't visual enough, and it wasn't as direct. So anyway, that continued to frustrate me in
The
San Francisco, and finally
Yeah,
finally it sort of came to a head, and I was routed off. But that kind of stuff, like I just never liked. I never liked being in the academy. I finished my staff status 2 in San Francisco, and then I went on to the at the time I was supposed to be the Div 7 Esto, which is a really stupid position, but the Div 7 Esto. So I went on to the mini hat. So because I didn't, because I somehow was transferred from Berlin, all the courses I did in Berlin, which was staff status 0 and 1, and then I had to owe for staff status 2. I had to owe for the establishment officer mini hat. Then they put me on a Dianetics basics course, which I had to pay for, like stupid. And then of course, I had M1 word clearing, and I had sec checks. So in total, I think it's somewhere between $5,000 and $6,000 was my freeloader bill. And most of those actions were not complete anyway. There's like 4 of them that weren't complete, which is ridiculous. I haven't paid them back. But yeah, basically just the frustration of just being in course and not really understanding and not liking study tech and having problems and not wanting to go on course. And then my senior was at the time a 17-year-old kid, second generation, who was also awful, and everyone was awful. And so my beginning of my end was just all these things started to boil up, and I'm thinking, okay, I don't think Scientology is for me. I think I would like to go. And then I mentioned to you before, um, and this was a whole process, getting my ethics files and my curricular files from Berlin to San Francisco took a long time. When they finally got there, the senior case supervisor, whose name is Steve Latch, who was in San Francisco, who was my landlord, um, CS'd them and determined that the previous N theta, or the whatever you want to call it, the black PR stuff that I had read when I was a teenager, was enough to offload me from staff. I got a dismissal from staff. I was declared not qualified for staff at all. So that even meant that I wasn't qualified was I was in Berlin. The people in Berlin had CF'd my folders, and I just got really, really frustrated. And I was kind of holding on for a little while, I thinking like, okay, maybe I could still do these actions. And then eventually that enthusiasm to stay just sort of went away once I returned home. And yeah, again, not wanting to be, I hated auditing, I hated studying, I hated my post. There was so many things I didn't like that when they offloaded me and basically gave me a freeloader bill, they kind of gave me an excuse to just not return. And it was actually blessing in disguise, because I haven't returned. I don't want to return. And it ended up being a great thing for me. So
This is
they did me
something
a
we see
favor.
a lot in Scientology when someone decides they want to leave as a
Yeah.
kind of saving face type activity.
Yeah.
Scientology then go, oh, well, we didn't want you anyway because you were out ethics and you didn't apply policy. And you were a
Yeah.
terrible staff member. So, actually, it's us kicking you out. You're not leaving on your
Yeah.
own accord. We didn't want you anyway.
Hmm.
When actually that's just kind of adding salt to the wound. You've had a bad
Yeah.
experience, and if they were just a bit nicer to you and said, oh, we're sorry it didn't work out, thank you for
Yeah.
the time you spent working for us, please
Yeah.
continue studying, and hopefully we can work it out and have a good relationship going forward, you probably would have stayed in a little bit longer and thought, oh, these
Yeah.
guys aren't too bad. But what they do is they just throw you out and kick you out, and in the process
Yep.
use all the information they have on you to possibly discredit you in any way or make you feel bad. Like you mentioned,
That's right.
having read stuff prior to joining Scientology as negative, and it was handled at the time 3 years prior,
Hmm.
that you told them what it was, you did this handling on it, they wrote it down, they said no problems, and it wasn't brought up again for the entire time you were
Yeah.
on staff until it
No,
came to
not at
the
all.
time that you leave. They then go, oh, and you shouldn't have even been on staff anyway because you read this stuff about Scientology that was bad. In today's day and age, how is it possible for anyone to join Scientology staff having not read something negative about Scientology? There is so much out there at the moment, and they're so desperate for staff. They're not helping themselves, are they?
No, they're shooting themselves in the foot. Like this being a staff member. I remember always being outside as a staff member and thinking, why aren't more people involved? Like, we're doing all these great things. We should have more staff member. We always need more staff members. When a staff member joins, it's like awesome, and then most of them leave. When publics join, it's awesome, and then most of them leave, and they just shoot themselves in the foot. And I actually do think that it's designed to fail. I just think that the amount of incompetence that is worked into things like the org board and their PR and their sales it's really not to get new members. I mean, if they did an overhaul of everything, they could get new members if they didn't go with the religion angle, if they actually had good public relations and addressed some of their controversies. If they came out and they said, "Yeah, you know what? Maybe we believe in some crazy stuff, but we don't care about that because we got things that we think can help people get over depression or whatever." Then if they were more honest, but at the end, after about a year or so of leaving, I just thought to myself, yeah, the only thing that makes sense is that this is designed to fail. You're being told that you're supposed to bring in money and people and new people and new staff members, but the whole thing is prevented for that. Like that's not the real goal. I think the goal is just that money goes up. That's it. And that, essentially David Miscavige, previously L. Ron Hubbard, are profiting from not just funds, but from all of the horrible labor and violations and unethical labor conditions that go on in a Church of Scientology, especially with the Sea Org, but also with us staff. So for me, when I was in there, I was thinking to myself, like, why doesn't the Sea Org just run all the Class 5 orgs? Like, doesn't that make sense? And why do you need an org board with 500 different people? Like I mentioned this to our mutual friend Duck. Like, there's a position called the Keys IC. Like, someone goes around to collecting keys like that. It's so bureaucratic and insane. So it's like, why don't you just have like a small skeleton crew of 15 people, maybe, like, and they're all from the Sea Org. And by the way, in Berlin, we had 10 Sea Org members there anyway. They could have run the whole show. And you don't need a 47,000 square foot former department store on Autozurale. Like, these things that were so obvious, and then you bury them. But eventually, when there's no more excuses, you just think, like, if I can walk into this place and make 2 or 3 observations that are, common sense, that would make this org actually be successful, why isn't it being implemented? And the reason, in my opinion, is because that's not what they want. They don't really want new people. They put all the pressure on staff to keep them in and to keep them isolated. It really isn't about clearing the planet or saving the world. It's about money going up and up and up. And they already have people who are OTs who are making money, who are doing all those things anyway. So it's impossible to get new members. It's impossible to be a staff member and even, live a decent, fair, equitable, equal life to anyone else who's working a job or whatnot. So to me, it's all just intention to fail, and all those preventative things that anyone can see on the first day, those out points, as we used to say, they're by design, and that's all it is, and that's the only thing that makes sense. Because I just, yeah, I can't come up with a rationale that would make it seem like, oh, it's just an accident and everyone's just evil. That doesn't make sense, you know.
Mm. And what was your I'm just thinking as we start to wrap up here, I think it would be interesting to talk about recovery a little bit and
Yeah.
what your recovery process was like. Because I did a similar thing when I was kicked off staff, so our ways of leaving are slightly different. But I continued to consider myself a Scientologist for a year or two afterwards, and even though I had this return program and I was declared a potential trouble source, and
Uh-huh.
similar sort of tactic of we don't want you anyway, I was fighting to still be a Scientologist, and I wanted to clear my name and continue studying and so on. But then there does come a point where you just sort of drift away and think, well, maybe I'm better off without it. And you kind of, for me at least, put it to bed in my mind and didn't really think about it very much. And it wasn't until 6 years after that that I
Mhm.
realized that there are still things that happen in my brain that are an effect of Scientology, the way that I process information or the way that I justify in my mind the way someone's reacting emotionally to something, for example. I realized, oh, I I think that because that's what Scientology's taught me to think. It's not I'm applying Scientology or I still believe in Scientology, but I just instinctively was doing things in my mind. And once I've realized that, then you can start to unpick it and work on that with a therapist or
Mhm.
however you want to do it. But what was your recovery process like? Was it, because some people are very different? Some people are very easily and quite quickly just drop it and never think of it again and are kind of done with it. What did that look like for you once you left?
Well, when I got offloaded on staff, I went to Los Angeles for a couple days. The last night that I was in Los Angeles in May 2005, I decided to leave on L. Ron Hubbard Way because I was basically not getting the answers I wanted, and I wasn't able to see
So
people
you
that
went
might have
your
been able to
own
give me some insight.
way, or on Hubbard way.
Yeah, I left on L. Ron Hubbard Way, exactly, right in front of Asho, by the way. So, yeah, I went home, and when I got home, that in my mind, especially on the airplane ride from Toronto to Los Angeles, like 5.5 hours, I decided, okay, I'm done. It probably took about a week by the time I started to tell my mom, I'm not going to do Scientology anymore. Just told some friends who I hadn't seen in a year because I was not in contact because they weren't Scientologists. And slowly by slowly during that summer, so June 2008, July 2008, around then in July 2008, I watched Jason Bigay's video, his 2-hour video with Mark Bunker. That op- just completely blew my charge, so to speak. And I, was like, I couldn't believe it because Jason was someone who I really admired as an actor and someone who I knew, like not knew personally, but knew of, who was in the church and so forth. Then I started going into that kind of rabbit hole where Mark Bunker in the early 2000s had done a bunch of videos with like Tori Chrisman, and then learning about what the OT levels actually were, and learning about how, like, yeah, Xenu is a part of Scientology, because of course people were telling me it wasn't true, and people that were on the OTs and had done OT3 were saying they weren't true, and then getting that evidence, handwritten stuff from Hubbard. When I was in the church, I listened to RJ67. That was one of the things on my ethics conditions. I had to listen to that. I also had to listen to a lecture called The Free Being. So there were always these little natterings or whatever, these little pockets and of the space opera stuff. But then when it was like proven, like, okay, these are what you do on the OT levels, and they were completely demystified, and this is what you do on OT8. Like, it's just your reactive mind is the reactive mind of your BTs, like this kind of thing. Then the whole thing comes down. The whole House of Cards falls. L. Ron Hubbard wasn't a war hero. He didn't graduate from college, or university, as we might say in the Commonwealth. But he had terrible grades. He wasn't a war hero. He wasn't a nuclear physicist. His degree from Sequoia University he made up. Like, it just started to fall. And probably I then moved to Los Angeles in January of 2009. And that's when I started to do like protests, and I started to meet people like Grant Barry. I met Mark Headley and Claire Headley there. I met Michael Pattinson, who's an OT8, my late great friend Gary Scarf, who became a very, very dear friend of mine, passed away in 2017. Met him. We had conversations because he was involved. And then, you meet ex-members, Tori Chrisman, Lynn Fountain Campbell. These are all high OTs. Karen de la Carriere, Jeffrey Augustine, who are also good friends. So, like, you just listen to people, you listen to their stories, and that gave me the confirmation that they're not in there to save the planet. They're in there to make money. Hubbard didn't know what the hell he was doing. He was very sick at the end of his life. He desperately, ironically, he desperately needed psychiatric help, and that essentially all we're doing in Scientology is conforming to him. We all have to become like Ron, but Ron wasn't like Ron. Ron was completely in a different mental state of, who knows, OCD, schizophrenia, depression, who knows what he had. But he himself was not. We are trying to live like Ron and be like Ron, but that's not how Ron was. And then again, my recovery, I would say, took a long time. Also because when I felt guilty, I felt like I betrayed the cause. Thursdays at 2 o'clock when you end the week, I remember having horrible flashbacks of just looking at the clock at Thursday at 2, and then thinking about all the people I left behind, and that was very traumatic. I mean, because you have survivor's guilt, and then really wanting to call my roommate and just give him all this information that I had found, and writing emails to people, which doesn't work. You're in a cult, and Hubbard lied, and none of that works. So it took a good, I'd say, at least 5, 6, 7 years. So by the time I guess it was, by the time, for example, maybe the Aftermath came out right around then, and even maybe a few years before that. And when Going Clear came out, I think that was around 2015 or something, 2016. That's when things, kind of had their moments. So, the first couple years are really bad. They're not going to be good. But then each preceding year after that, and the more people you meet and the more reading you do, like I read Russell Miller's Barefaced Messiah, which was incredible. And then I read the X-Member books, Jeff Hawkins, Mark Headley. I just recently read Billionaire Contract, Mike Rinder's book, which was fantastic. Chris Shelton, who's a friend, I read his book. You start to learn the things that you didn't know, and then it becomes easier. So now, like, I'm not haunted anymore by Scientology. The fact that I have, three people, four people who are expert Berlin org staff who I know, and I contact one of them, a young woman named Sabrina. We were like talking every day because we're the only people who knew what the heck was going on there. And that's only been since 2018. So that was another great step, a very cathartic step, to meet someone who was there at the time I was. And now, we can talk freely, and it's great. Like, so every year it gets better. Hubbard says something extremely toxic, and I remember this in the Dianetics lectures. He says, time does not heal all wounds. It does. It takes time, and that's the problem when you're feeling terrible now. If you've left, a year will be better, 2 years will be better, 5 years, 10 years, and I've been out since, 15 years. I will be celebrating my 15 years of being out in Scientology in May of this year, and I can't believe it's been that long, and I've made so many great friends along the way. So you'll have a
And in
better time being
Scientology,
out.
yeah, in
Yeah.
Scientology, when you're on staff and in the SEAL particularly, there's such a
Mhm.
push to get things done
Oh,
now and be as
yep.
efficient and effective as possible, which in my
Oh,
mind never really made sense, because if you signed a
no.
billion-year contract, you've got millions of lives to achieve the goals that you're setting out to do. So what is the
Yeah.
rush? Why do we need to clear the planet this lifetime when I've just given you a billion years of lifetime? So
Right.
why are we rushing? Time is the one thing we've got loads of, which didn't quite make
Yeah.
sense in my mind. But the way Scientology operates is, well, that's because you go on to target 2, and then there's the whole universe
Yeah.
to clear. We're just starting with Earth. So the idea of getting Earth cleared now is a really urgent, important thing, runs through with everything you do in your work life, being productive, being
Mhm.
efficient, and there's always a rush to everything you're doing. When you come
Yeah.
out of Scientology, you realize that not everyone in the world is in a rush to get things done, and particularly
Yep.
things that work on the mind and mental health are things that take time. And
Yeah.
that's a really important step to learn when you're leaving Scientology, is that you may want to do all of the healing and all of the processes needed to fully unindoctrinate your mind and be free and do what you want to do and catch up on all the life you've missed and so on. And I
Mhm.
understand and get the urgency. However, it's not going to happen overnight, and it's something
Yeah.
that does take time, because you have to learn, you have to relearn how to think, almost, in some ways.
Mhm.
And actually, by taking a step back and breathing a little bit, actually you'll notice it does happen a lot quicker than you realize. But you
Mhm.
kind of have to get out of that headspace of getting it done now. um all
Yeah.
right, so one
Within
final
a
question.
For example,
Yeah.
just sorry, but just within a year, within a year, within 6 months, I was done with the Scientology speak and and even now I can hardly remember some stuff. So that goes away as
For me
quickly
though,
as anything else as your speech.
I've
Yeah, for
noticed
me.
it comes out when I speak to another, in
Yeah.
everyday life, I don't really use Scientology language
Yeah.
much at all. But if I'm on a call with like Doug, or
Yeah.
with, Claire Headley or someone else, a former Scientologist, these words just come, the lingo comes out. And
They
then
do.
afterwards, I'm like,
I've done
it
it
is
here a couple
different
times.
language, isn't it? But there are some
Yeah.
words, like I was talking
Kita,
to Doug last
blow
night
by
about the word
charge.
cognition. Cognition is not a
Yeah.
Scientology word, but it's a word that's used
No.
a lot in Scientology. And it's just a really good word for like
Yeah.
describing what you're talking about. So there is some positive from language when it comes to describing things happening in Scientology. But yeah, it does come back out when you're talking to another former member, I've noticed.
Yes.
um
But yeah,
if you could say to L. Ron Hubbard, um anything, one thing, say he was to come back and he was sat there in front of you right now and you could say one thing to him, what would you say to him?
I've never thought of that. That is an excellent, excellent question. I guess my one word that annoys people all the time, but I love saying it, is why. Just why? Like, why this? Why? Why did you do this? What was your motivation? And I might even say, do you really think that uh, you were helped by what you were doing? Like, in the end, were you really OT? Did you really feel that, you as an individual, forget everything else, were better for, spending 36 years of your life devoted to this one cause? So why did you do it? And did it actually give you any benefits? And of course, we kind of know the answers, but I would want to see the reaction. Plus, I did a big terrible thing after I left Scientology, and I went to journalism school, and I learned journalism, which of course are the merchants of chaos. So I have a much better way to detect BS now, and I would be looking for some of those things. And I kind of doubt that he would be able to convince me. But I guess that would be it. And that is an excellent question. Yeah, excellent question. Yeah, thank you for asking it. Yeah,
No
I'm going to be
problem,
thinking
Mark
about that
Turi.
later too.
No problem, Mark Turi. Thank you so much for this interview and chatting to me and being a guest on my channel. I think let's definitely do this again and do a part two. I'd love to delve into a bit more of the in-depth day-to-day stuff of being a staff member in a class 5 org, and there's so much we didn't talk about. But yeah, let's book in a second date and get in for part 2 at some point.
Yeah, of course. Thank you again. Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you for giving me that question. I'm gonna be thinking about it for a while, so I appreciate that very much. And yeah, thank you. This is a great YouTube channel. It's always great when someone who is an ex comes out and does a YouTube channel. So again, thanks a lot. Appreciate it.